Good afternoon, gamers. Jaraoh here, back for our Friday metagame review, kind of, throwing you a little curveball this fine evening. So, for the last couple weeks, I have been showcasing decks that have been performing well in real-life events and the third-party tournament circuits. I'm going to mostly be doing the same thing today. I do have 4 decks again to show you guys, but as opposed to the last couple weeks where I was showing you basically just like the top decks floating around the meta, I didn't want to make another video where I was just playing or expanding on Kai'Sa and Master Yi. So I've got 3 other decks that I wanted to showcase today that I think are quite good and have a real place in the meta, even if they're not taking the top slots, right? Because Kai'Sa and Yi are kind of dominating on that front. And then I also have a deck that I wanted to showcase where even though I think it's doing something pretty cool, I would advise staying away from the strategy. And not to be a hater on the strategy, but I kind of wanted to showcase my reasons on why I think that's the case and what I think the problems are with the current archetype that potentially could be fixed going forward, right? Let's go ahead and get right into it. I am starting on the deck of the 4 that I would recommend staying away from unless something changes or you can find a different build that kind of supplements the issues that I'm going to get into. But this is an MF deck that looks like it got top 8, 5th place at the Beijing City Challenge. And on the surface, I think this deck is doing something very, very cool. It's going to be your generic Aurora style deck. But because you're playing the orange with the purple, your only resource gain effects are the Mobilize and the Catalyst. So, right off the rip, you're playing a ramp deck, and you only have the 6 ramp spells, right? Yi has access to 9, right, because of Find Your Center. Some of the other variants would have access to, other ways that maybe can mitigate that via, extra removal, what have you. My issue with Misfortune is kind of twofold, potentially even threefold. So, there are some things about the deck that I like. I really like the Pack of Wonders Treasure Trove interaction. I like that quite a bit. I'm also a pretty big fan of the Sabotage in the deck. I think this is kind of like a very cool pre-boarded answer for the post-board games to deal with something like a Salvage that could protect your Aurora. Or just a card that is giving you problems or could potentially give you problems in the mid-game in your game 1 scenarios, because it is in the main deck, of course. I also really like Stack Deck, I apologize. This is a style card that wasn't getting a lot of love at the beginning of, the play cycles, and us Magic players know how powerful this kind of effect is, right? Especially in a game where you're getting the 2 resources a turn for free. This ends up just being a very, very powerful effect. And you even have some side bonuses that you'll see with later archetypes where you can get value out of the things that you're not putting into your hand. Very, very powerful card. So I've talked about some of the things that I like about the deck. I want to get into the reasons I think it doesn't actually function as a deck and why you should kind of steer clear from it. So I already kind of touched on the only 6 ramp spells. The other problem going on here is that you don't actually have any real way to remove early game threats. I mean, you can, gust early units back, but you are very dependent on finding Aurora and having your units stick around to dominate the board with things like Ride the Wind once they're in play, or Primal Strength for that matter, right? So there's a couple reasons why I kind of think that doesn't work. One, it puts you more all in on Aurora than the other Aurora variations, I believe. It also makes you more vulnerable to the removal that people are playing, right? I'm thinking like Cole the Weak. I'm thinking, some of Kai's, bigger damage spells, or chaining some of them together. I think it can be a real liability, even though some of your units are gigantic, right? When you're that all in on them, I think you're opening yourself up to a weakness that is potentially not necessary. And you're leaning into cards that I don't actually think make a lot of sense, right? So, Primal Strength as an example. The Aurora decks don't even play that card generally, right? The ramp decks will, because it's a very powerful card on its surface, and being able to use that on a smaller unit to dominate a battlefield, A+, makes a lot of sense. While some of the other versions are playing the Protector Drake, right? The green bird, they might play the Drake that gives something +8 might when it enters. The reason those don't kind of function the same is because the Drake is something that you're playing off of your Aurora. It kind of leads into your plan A. It's not a liability in that sense. Primal Strength is a massive liability because it's just another card in the whole amalgamation that doesn't do anything when you don't have your Aurora, right? And generally speaking, these kind of decks, your goal should be, when you're playing a functionally a one-card combo deck, you should be trying to make your deck as good as possible when you don't have your combo card, under the assumption that the deck is already very good when you have it, right? You could argue that as Aurora in this case. I would almost more or less argue that it's the Mobilized Catalyst, and then hopefully with your card draw engine of Pack of Wonders, Treasure Trove, and Stack Deck, you actually find the Auroras pretty easily. And I kind of assume that that's the case as well. So I would say that the combo element of this deck is actually finding your Mobilizes and your Catalysts very early, because I think without them, this deck will I think you'll just lose to people that are playing 2 or 3 units on the first couple turns of the game, basically every time, right? Because it's a really big ask in the games that you don't draw your resource ramp cards, to ask your opponent to go through the entire game, have a curve, and then have no answers for any of your big units, right? Most decks are designed to fight Yi at this point. This deck functions very similar when it's interacting with its main game plan to Yi, and expecting people to not have an answer to your mid to end game plan when you're not doing anything effectively in the early game, I just think is too massive of a liability. I want to note how good of a card I think Bullet Time is before I kind of, wrap up the misfortune section here. I think Bullet Time is an awesome card. I just believe that it needs to be in a different style archetype. I don't really see the vision. I kind of get that because it's an action, if you're trying to defend your battlefield, your units are so big that they have to send multiple units in. And then the goal is, maybe you get to Bullet Time effectively on defense and, blow up 3 or 4 units that were trying to go after a Mind Splitter or Predator board that you had set up on a battlefield. That makes sense. I get that. But again, you're just leaning in to these cards that are assuming your deck is working, right? When your deck isn't working and you're trying to get to these 9 resources for Aurora because, say, maybe you didn't ramp, well, then Bullet Time is kind of one of the worst removal cards you could have access to, right? Because then it's denying you even more time to get to the Aurora. Sure, you might be killing some units, but your opponent is just going to refuel those units in theory most of the time, and then you're still setting yourself back even further on the Aurora. So that's basically going to wrap up this segment. I just wanted to kind of pinpoint some things that were interesting to me, because at this point, as cool as some of the things are that this deck is doing, in particular Mind Splitter, I'm a really big fan of Mind Splitter Aurora. I think this deck just needs a little more help, whether it be more access to ramp or more access to real removal that doesn't also set you back in the process. If it gets access to those things, I think this is a super cool archetype to explore further. But right now, I kind of think this is something that you should desperately stay away from if given the opportunity. All right. Now to the 3 decks that I think are quite good. And we're also City Challenge winners and or top finishers. So I have already highlighted Yasuo videos on my channel for gameplay purposes. Kind of wanted to chat about what's going on here because I think there's some interesting things. Invert Timeline is a card that, again, Magic players will relate to a Wheel of Fortune-esque style of effect. I think these kind of cards generally perform better than they look, especially when you're playing an archetype that doesn't actually have a lot of inherent card advantage. And this deck is actually one of those cards, right? Or one of those archetypes, rather. I think you're less likely to see this kind of card in maybe like a purple-blue archetype like Teemo, or something where the blue mine cards tend to have a lot of card draw already inherently attached to them, right? I'm thinking Yordles and the Sentries and stuff like that. While we have Discipline here, which is a pretty good, card draw / combat trick that serves a very good function, I still think that this card has a lot of value here when you're not really getting a lot of card advantage elsewhere. And you're also kind of doing something pretty unique in that you're flooding the board with cards like the Mask of Foresight, which work pretty well in multiples. You're playing a bunch of hidden cards, and you're kind of really desperately leaning into this 1 unit per battlefield mindset, which I think is a surprisingly pretty good place to be, actually. So it does make you potentially a little weak to something that I've mentioned before, like Hold the Weak and Hidden Blade. You have Defy for those. So right off the rip, reasonable place to land, I think. Also, I think when you're trying to do the ganking thing with Yasuo, and then Kayn for that matter, of trying to serve a similar role, I think, as Master Yi archetypes have shown us, aside from some of those very specific removal spells, it's actually quite a bit harder to interact with one big creature versus a bunch of smaller creatures. And kind of the reasons I'm thinking for that, you have things like Ari Legend ability, you have things like Falling Star, you have things like, the Stupefies and the On Guards of the World, which in the small unit combat are so much more impactful than they are in the big creature combat, right? Generally speaking. This is another, again, purple deck that is kind of taking advantage of Stack Deck, which was something we did not see at the beginning of the game's kind of lifespan. And I think you're just going to see this going forward with every purple deck. I think every purple deck is basically going to be playing 3 Stack Deck. Some of them might be doing the Nocturne thing, which we'll see later. Some of them may not. But this just ends up being a very powerful card that you're going to want access to if you're playing this color combination, or this color in general. Another interesting things of note, where most of the archetypes are relying on 1 and 2 cost combat tricks, we're kind of doing the same here, but we do lean into slightly more expensive stuff with like something like Find Your Center that we can play on our opponent's turn if given the option in a showdown. Discipline, of course, which is a standard. Block, which is kind of a different thing because I don't actually think Block is a card that this deck should be interested in playing. I think this should most likely be something else. But then Ride the Wind and Last Stand is other more expensive tricks than what we would usually have. And I like this deck for a couple reasons, actually. So one, I think leaning into Kayn makes a lot of sense. I think you do want some redundancy with your Yasuo ability, or your Yasuo champion unit, rather. Really, really leaning on Ride the Wind plus Yasuo or Kayn in the mid-late game to finish off the game. I think that's a totally reasonable strategy, especially when you've already accumulated, a mask or 2 in play, right? Maybe set up a couple defies. I think this is a really, really good plan, and you'll see that one of the other decks that we look at later on are doing something similar, being, kind of an aggressive slanted deck, leading on a Ride the Wind combo to win the game. Basically, if you can set up these scenarios where the Ride the Wind plus another unit combo guarantees you 2 points. You end up in this spot where you really only have to get to 6 points before you can combo your opponent out. And even in the mid to late game, it ends up being very difficult for your opponent to leave a bunch of resources untapped. Even if they kind of know the combo's coming, just the nature of the game, a lot of the more powerful cards people are trying to play and rely on are expensive, and the game requires you to recycle your resources pretty consistently to continuously play powerful cards. So you end up in these spots where your opponent is kind of damned if they do, damned if they don't. Yasuo, I think, pushes that even a step further because of access to Defy. You end up kind of getting to play Defy a little more proactively than some of the other green decks because you get to use it as a protective spell for your combo to finish the game. I think a little more often than most other green decks do. I think most of the time, these green decks, even in Ahri, for example, where it can be more of an offensive tool there as well, I think most of the time, Defy is used as this kind of like, prevent my guy from dying to your Void Seeker type card, or prevent my guy from dying to your Discipline type card. So I think getting to lean on those more aggressive elements is very good. And I also think when you're leaning into the one unit at a time at a battlefield, cards like Zhonya's end up being quite a bit better, right? Obviously, Zhonya's is very good in the ramp-style archetypes, where all of your creatures are gigantic. But I think it's exceptional here, where you're not really giving your opponent to kill a small unit, right? That's when Hourglass is at its worst, right? If your board is flooded with a bunch of 2-cost units, and you're just Hourglassing one of those, that's not very valuable use of a card. But if you're always, bringing back a Yasuo, bringing back even a Watcher as your worst scenario, or, Sona's a good example, there's not really a bad thing to Hourglass back in this archetype. Notably, I want to mention one of my things that I'm kind of a big fan of with green at the moment. The more that I'm looking at a lot of these lists, I think there's gigantic advantages to being green and yellow. I tend to think green and yellow, little outskirts of blue, but green and yellow have the absolute best sideboard cards. Meditation is one. I understand what they're doing with it. The goal is kind of like outgrind some of the slower, more controlling style archetypes. But Adaptron and Windwall just end up being very, very powerful sideboard cards. Windwall, I imagine there are some other scenarios where you could want it, but you for sure want it against the Time Warp style decks. Ends up just being incredibly powerful for this cost to be able to counter a Time Warp when your opponent's spent their entire game plan trying to kind of lean into that and build up to it. And then Adaptron for the Aurora decks, of course, right? A lot of these Aurora style decks, they're very light on creatures. They have no creatures in play usually when they go for the Aurora turn, which almost always means if you plan for the Aurora coming down and retreat from either both battlefields or one specific battlefield they're not going to go after, you set yourself up for the free conquer if you're just holding this in your hand, and you can almost always get that proc to deal with the Aurora immediately. And if they only get one use out of their Aurora, that's insane value, because they've spent their entire turn to maybe get a very strong unit in, but it's a random unit. If it's not Predator, they didn't even get to put it on a battlefield, most likely. And that just ends up being an excellent exchange, much like Salvage, which we've discussed in past videos. The tempo that you get from them spending a 9 energy to recycle resource card for you to just play a unit that's like reasonably statted anyways and remove it for free is an unreasonable amount of tempo to take over, and I think you're almost always going to win those games when that happens. Alright, so away from Yasuo we go, and let's go on to Teemo. Teemo is an archetype growing in popularity, and it is very near and dear to my heart. This is the first. Again, all of the decks that we're showcasing today are purple. By pure coincidence, that was not like a goal or anything that we were trying to do. But another purple archetype, another stacked deck archetype. This is the first one that we're seeing that is, again, because it's Teemo, right? Really leaning into the hidden mechanic. You'll see we even are playing Bandle Tree, which is going to allow us to, at that battlefield, hide a second card. And this deck is doing something very cool, but it's also doing something I think very powerful. So right now, the way decks are designed, good players that are kind of staying on top of the meta and aware of what common deck lists look like are almost always aware of what the hidden card is when their opponent plays one. There's not a lot of use for the mechanic the way I think the developers designed it, right? I think they designed a lot of these hidden cards to in the opinion of, wow, isn't it so cool if I hide this card and the opponent has no idea what it is and they make a play and you just get it, right? You just get that like Yu-Gi-Oh! Trap card feel, right? But in practice, what ends up happening is the decks are so refined, lists are kind of like coming down the echo chamber where people are doing a lot of copying and fine-tuning. You almost always know what the hidden card is, and this is the one deck that, because you're playing so many different copies of different variations, actually abuses that mechanic and can put your opponent in really difficult positions, especially if there's somebody that has a playstyle like me who will try to kind of... I try to play around basically everything, and if I'm like playing against a Teemo deck, for example, I'm going to be having nightmares because I'm going to try and figure out what my play should be around each of the 5 or 6 hidden cards that it could be. And that is just an incredibly like powerful effect and a large amount of versatility, right? When you have access to so many of these different hidden cards and they're so modal and they do something so different, it makes your opponent, it puts them in an almost impossible situation, right? Where they're almost always going to have to overcommit or undercommit, and you just have all the agency, which is a term that a lot of competitive card game players like, right? The more ability you have to kind of like express your will over the game and have luck not be involved, players generally gravitate to those kind of things. So I wouldn't be surprised if an archetype like this becomes more popular going forward. Other things of note, I mentioned from the Misfortune deck that I really liked the card advantage engine of the 2 chests picking each other up. I understand why this archetype isn't doing that, but I almost wonder if there is a world where it could be. Alternatively, this is also a deck where it's playing 2 of the invert timelines, and I wonder how good that is here. Kind of with the logic being is we have a lot of expensive cards, and generally speaking, this kind of style of effect is better when more of your cards are cheaper. Now, the rest of our expensive cards do generally have hidden, right? That is a benefit to that, and that's kind of where the synergy comes in. But if you're playing 3 Mundo, I just kind of imagine these scenarios where, like, you have a Time Warp and a Mundo, or a Mundo and an Echo in your hand, kind of in the mid-game, and maybe your opponent has, accrued a bunch of cards, and you're kind of incentivized to just, like, make them discard 6 or 7 cards for this effect, right? And only get 4 as a replacement. So I would like to maybe see some slight modifications on that front. I also kind of have this personal opinion that I think Teemo should probably be playing some number of seals. We see that a lot of decks have concluded that seals, if you're not kind of doing the Legion thing with them, like in yellow, or a very aggressive thing in red, like what we'll see with the next archetype, where you're kind of using the card disadvantage to your advantage in the mid-game. I kind of just, while most people have concluded that they're just not worth the draw step because you already get resources for free every turn, I think this deck, because you have so many hidden cards, and the hidden aspect is so important to your playstyle, and arguably most importantly to that point, you actually have good ways, I think, to mitigate the extra copies that you wouldn't want. Because this deck has so much what we would call loot or rummage in Magic. So you have Merchant, you have Zon Warrens, you have Timeline, and I think all of those pieced together is a really, really strong reason to maybe consider playing a couple seals in this deck. With this kind of iteration, it looks like the blue one would make more sense, right? And I don't really know if that would change the way that you want to build the deck going forward. But that's just kind of like a strategy thing that I think this deck could benefit from some seals. But another thing this deck is doing that I wanted to kind of hint at, I do think this deck is using some of the more powerful engines. I just kind of have this take that I think Traveling Merchant and Ravenbloom Student, the more I play games with these style of cards, I think these might just be the best 2-cost units in the game. I think Student, full stop, is the best 2-cost unit in the game that doesn't require, any recycling. I'm kind of saying that off the top of my head. That's not researched. So, but I think I'm willing to commit to that. I think Student is just unbelievable how powerful it is. And then I think this loot effect is very underrated. I think so many of the 2s that you're going to be kind of trading with in the early game are, Assault or Deflect or, what have you, that I just don't think you're going to get outclassed in combat in the early to mid game that often. And I think this discard draw effect is just crazy, crazy powerful. Notably, the discard draw, while being good with the seals that I'm talking about, maybe the deck being interested in playing, it's also just a very good interaction with the Scrap Heap card. And the more style of effect that you can add to the deck, the more likely you maybe are to play Scrap Heap, more copies of it, and I think that's a really powerful engine. So I think this deck is particularly sweet going forward, and I'm really, really interested to kind of see if people can make any adaptations here, because I think this is... I think Teemo very likely is one of the archetypes that has the most... the largest range that it could still make from where it is currently to where it could get before lists are fine-tuned. All right, and last, but certainly not least... So, Jinx, fan favorite, another purple deck, another stack deck archetype. The first one that we've seen using stack deck plus Nocturne. Very powerful interaction. Particularly a powerful interaction when you're already a seal deck. A+. I love that. This deck is doing something that I think is very important. And, quite frankly, very powerful. So, this is what I would classify as effectively kind of an all-in, red deck win style aggro deck. You're playing functionally no card advantage, right? You're playing merchants to get some looting in. You're playing a lot of seals, which with only a few ways to proc discarding them to get new copies of it, because you definitely don't want to draw multiple seals, most likely. Stack deck, which is just a card replacement. While it's a very good effect, you're not actually creating card advantage from it. And then you're playing the Enforcer, which you are playing because of your Chompers, right? Apps, and then, again, extra cop, plenty of things to discard. The Chompers far and away being the best. You also get the added synergy. Of course, this whole deck works because of the Jinx Legend ability, which is pretty common knowledge at this point. But this is another deck how what we discussed with the Yasuo deck. When your aggro deck only has to do 75% of the damage to win the game, right? Player health, whatever you want to classify victory points as. And you have this combo that you can rely on that's very consistent and mostly unpunishable to close the game out for you. It's a very powerful place to be. That combo in this particular instance, if you are following along, you probably already knew where we were going. It's Vi Ride the Wind. For my Magic Boomers, Vi, one of my favorite cards that has been shown for Origins. It just reminds me of one of my favorite Magic cards of all time, which is Psychotog, even though the style of archetype is radically different. This card gives very, very positive memories. And the interaction that Vi has with Ride the Wind, where you can sandbag both cards, basically, until you are set up. Opponent, you have 6 victory points, whatnot. Anytime that they tap out, right, are out of resources, you win the game on the spot in the mid to late game because you play Vi, she's exhausted, you remove however many, recycle however many cards are in your trash, you make her a 15 might, right, and then you Ride the Wind, take over a battlefield, attack the other battlefield with ganking, win the game. Very, very strong way to close out a game. And because that is your strength to close, it's just very important to make sure that you have the aggression to win the game early, to deal those 6 points early. And this deck is leaning all into that, which I like, right? You're playing Gust and Fight or Flight as just your move out of the way. I'm not trying to remove your threats permanently. You have Falling Star, which is, I think at this point, mostly recognized as the best removal spell in the game. Just not every archetype has access to it, right? Kai'Sa is the best use of it for obvious reasons, her legend ability. Jinx is the one archetype that feels totally fine playing a bunch of seals because they don't go to waste because of her legend ability as well. That gives you the ability to play Falling Star without the major drawback of the double recycle. A+ deck building there. And then, where you could play other card advantage elements potentially, this deck is just not interested in doing that. It's all in on Enforcer Chomper. Teemo is your hidden card, which is basically just 1 recycle, add 4 might to the board. Particularly good, again, when you're spamming these seals. Red Jinx for your accelerate, Hopefuls for your spam, Nocturne for your stack deck interaction. And honestly, just like a totally fine mid-game threat when your deck is, I don't want to say fumbling, but just like not humming, right? Totally fine spell to play on turn 3 or 4, what have you, in the mid-game. Sundisk, probably the reason this deck gets to lean so heavily into the aggressive slants, because, again, not even that bad on multiples, but even when you do have multiples, you have plenty of ways to discard them. And having all of your units effectively be able to come into play ready is just going to lead more into that tempo. It's going to make it so hard for your opponent to keep pace with you that even if they get to a point where all of their units are bigger and they're dominating the battlefield, you've probably already gotten to that 4 or 5, maybe even 6 point range where you are just so close to closing out the game with 2 cards that it is not hard to set up a scenario where you can initiate combat that trades for that last point here or there before you close out the game. This deck is very fun. I think this is going to be your very popular generic aggro deck for a couple reasons. I think people like this style of like all-in-y aggressive archetypes to begin with. I think Jinx is a very popular legend. I think that's going to play into it a little bit. I think I am not alone in thinking that the Vi plus Ride the Wind combination is very cool and a very fun way to close out games. And I think people are already very interested in a lot of these, what you would call quote-unquote nut draw scenarios of who doesn't want to do the Enforcer into Chomper's draw, right? Or the even better Seal into Enforcer into Chomper's draw. So I just think this deck has a lot going for it that is going to draw players in that lean towards these aggressive shells. I have a lot of buddies that I play Magic with that are, red deck, Llanowar Elf deck type gamers. This is a deck that I think is going to be right up their alley that they're going to really enjoy gaming with when I'm teaching them the game. And I just think it's incredibly powerful to top it off. I by no means think it is the beginner kind of like easy to play starter engine deck that maybe they would have you believe it is along with Annie, right? Other notable things of interest with this particular archetype before we call it for this session. Very interesting that it has Cleave in the sideboard. My suspicion, and Poro kind of for that matter as well, my suspicion is that they probably think Poro is pretty good against Kai'Sa, which I think has got to be true, because I'm not really sure where else the small unit with Deflect has a lot of value. Cleave probably is for these like Set or like maybe Darius style decks that are like trying to go big. Maybe it could be against Kai'Sa as well, but I feel like Kai'Sa has enough removal that would not line up particularly well. So this is one of those things where I would have to pick the actual player's brain. I don't have a lot of insight into this, but I just thought it was very interesting that they were playing, 5 of their sideboard slots were cards that I think most people would just deem as, cards that you either play in your main deck or don't play at all, right? In particular, this is just a deck that you would think would benefit from Cleave very well. But then when you actually get into it, right, it is kind of a very, like, fine-tuned machine. What are you cutting, right? So there's a world where, you know, like maybe the gust fighter flight stuff isn't as good. Maybe there's a world where the traveling merchant stuff isn't as good, and you would rather just have a slightly more durable unit. Maybe that's what you do against Kaisa. I'm not real sure, but I just thought that that was an interesting point that was worth discussing. Somebody, you know, had success, won their city challenge with this kind of sideboard package. All right. And guys, I think that's going to do it for us. It was cool to be able to showcase a few different decks that weren't, you know, your typical Kaisa and Master Yi. I do kind of suspect that I will do a tier list at some point. Maybe I'll do a tier list for my review next week, with the logic being, you know, the game will be released, people will actually be maybe more aggressive and like trying to put stuff together. So yeah, I think that's probably the plan for this series going forward. But yeah, it was really cool to just be able to showcase some decks that, even if they're not in the S tier, you know, maybe the A, B tier, where, you know, there's still some modifications people can make and some cool things that people can tinker with. All right. If you kind of liked what we did today, you enjoyed what you saw, go ahead and throw me out a like, a comment, and a subscribe. Helps the channel grow quite a bit. And it's been a good time doing this with y'all. It's been really fun making content and trying to give away some of my knowledge from other games that I've played competitively. And even if they're not, you know, directly, you know, one-to-one on what's good in one game might be good in another, it's kind of just been fun to yap about things that I think are good and bad, quite frankly. So yeah, that's going to do it for us today. I appreciate y'all hanging out. And until next time, peace.